The gavel didn't bang. It cracked like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. Richard Sterling adjusted his silk tie, a smirk playing on his lips as he looked across the aisle at his soon-to-be ex-wife, Sarah. He had won. The forensic accountants had hidden his millions. His lawyer had dismantled her character, and in minutes he would walk away with his empire intact, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. He was already planning the celebratory dinner with his mistress. But then, Judge Harrison Miller stopped shuffling his papers. He took off his glasses, leaned over the bench, and looked Richard dead in the eye. The silence stretched until it was suffocating. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, "you seem to believe you have outsmarted this court. But before I bang this gavel, answer me one question. Do you actually know who your wife's father is?" Richard Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office in downtown Chicago, watching the tiny cars crawl through the gridlock 30 stories below. It was a grey, miserable Tuesday, but to Richard, the city looked like a kingdom waiting to be reconquered. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, a 25-year-old Macallan, opened specifically for this afternoon. "You're tense, Rick. Relax," a voice purred from the leather sofa behind him. Jessica, his personal assistant, and the reason his marriage was currently incinerating, was scrolling through Zillow on her iPad. She wasn't looking for rentals. She was looking for estates. "I'm not tense, Jess. I'm anticipatory," Richard replied, taking a sip. "There's a difference. Tomorrow is the final hearing. By noon, Sarah will be history, and Sterling Logistics will be legally untouchable." He turned back to the room. It was sleek, modern, and expensive, just like him. Richard was 42, handsome in a jagged, predatory way, and possessed the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been told no effectively. He had built his logistics company from a small regional trucking firm into a national juggernaut. Or at least, that was the story he told Forbes. The reality was a bit more complex, involving aggressive buyouts and creative accounting, but the narrative was what mattered. "Are you sure she doesn't know about the Cayman accounts?" Jessica asked, looking up. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. It was one of the things he liked about her. Sarah had always been too soft, too content with a quiet night in. Jessica wanted blood and diamonds. "Arthur says she hasn't even subpoenaed the offshore records." Richard laughed, walking over to pour another drink. Arthur Pendleton was his lawyer, a man who charged $600 an hour to destroy lives and was worth every penny. Sarah hired some strip mall attorney, a guy named Bernard or something. Probably does wills and traffic tickets. They don't have the resources to find what I've buried. Richard sat on the edge of the desk, loosening his tie. "Here's how it plays out tomorrow. We present the prenup. It's ironclad. She signed it 10 years ago, when she was a starry-eyed waitress, and I was just starting out. She gets a lump sum of $50,000 and the 2018 Honda. I keep the company, the house in the Hamptons, the portfolio, and the dignity. And if she cries?" Jessica smirked. "Let her cry," Richard said coldly. "Tears don't move assets." He thought back to the night he served her the papers. It had been 3 months ago. He had expected screaming, throwing vases, perhaps a plea for counseling. Instead, Sarah had just stood there in the kitchen of their sprawling suburban mansion, holding a dish towel. She had looked at the papers, then at him, her face unreadable. She hadn't shed a tear. She had simply nodded and said, "Okay, Richard, if that's what you want." Her passivity had annoyed him then, but now he saw it as a blessing. She was weak. She was a simple girl from some backwater town in Virginia, who had lucked into a decade of luxury. Now, the ride was over. Arthur called, Richard added, checking his phone. The judge assigned to the case is Harrison Miller. Old school, strict, hates wasting time. He'll look at the prenup, see that Sarah has no case, and stamp the decree. We'll be at lunch by 12:30. Jessica stood up and walked over to him, tracing a finger down his lapel. Good, because I found a house in Lake Geneva that needs a serious renovation. We're going to need that budget. Richard kissed her, feeling the thrill of total victory. He had taken everything he wanted in life. He had outmaneuvered his business rivals, he had dodged the IRS audits, and now he was discarding a wife who no longer fit his brand. He truly believed he was the smartest man in every room he walked into. He had no idea that the simple girl he was divorcing had made a single phone call the night he served her. He had no idea that while he was hiding assets in shell companies, Sarah was compiling a binder of documents thick enough to stop a bullet. And he certainly had no idea that Judge Harrison Miller wasn't just old school. 3 months earlier, the atmosphere in the Sterling household had been toxic enough to choke on. But on the outside, Sarah Bennett, she had stopped using Sterling in her head long before the papers arrived, maintained the facade of the dutiful wife. Sarah was 34, with soft features and a quiet demeanor that often caused people to talk over her. At charity galas, she was the one holding the purses, while the other wives gossiped. When Richard berated the waitstaff at restaurants, she was the one who silently tipped extra when he wasn't looking. To Richard, she was furniture. Decorative, necessary for the domestic image, but ultimately silent. He had forgotten where she came from. The night of the filing, after Richard had stormed out to go work late, which Sarah knew meant meeting Jessica at the St. Regis, Sarah didn't collapse. She didn't call her friends to sob. She walked into Richard's home office. For years, Richard had been sloppy at home. He assumed Sarah was too stupid to understand his business, so he left bank statements, incorporation papers, and emails open on his desktop. He didn't know that Sarah had a master's degree in forensic accounting. He had never asked. When they met, she was waitressing to pay off her student loans without her father's help, trying to make it on her own. Richard had swept her off her feet, and she had put her career on hold to support his dream. She sat at his desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating her pale face. She opened a folder on her encrypted USB drive labeled Exit Strategy. "You want a war, Richard?" she whispered to the empty room. "You'll get an apocalypse." The next morning, she met with her lawyer. He wasn't a strip mall attorney, as Richard would later joke. David Bernard was a semi-retired shark who only took cases that amused him. He worked out of a small, messy office because he hated the pretension of big firms, not because he lacked the skill. "He's offering 50 grand, David said, tossing the initial settlement offer onto his cluttered desk. He looked at Sarah over his reading glasses. "It's an insult, Sarah. The man is worth 40 million if a dime." 52 million, Sarah corrected calmly. He moved 12 million into a holding company called Nebula Corp in Nevada last week. He thinks I don't know about the real estate purchase in Belize. David whistled low. "You have proof?" Sarah reached into her tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Wire transfers, email confirmations, and the deed to the Belize property. I also have his texts with Jessica Thorne discussing how to undervalue the vintage car collection. David picked up the documents, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Remind me never to piss you off, Mrs. Sterling." "I don't want just half, David," Sarah said, her voice steady but cold as ice. "I want him to admit what he did. He's telling everyone I was a gold digger. He's telling our friends I contributed nothing. I built that company's initial bookkeeping system. I managed the payroll for the first 3 years for free. I introduced him to the investors who saved him in 2019. We can prove that, David nodded. But the prenup is nasty. It waives spousal support regardless of contribution. The prenup has a clause, Sarah said. Section 4, paragraph B. Full disclosure of assets at the time of signing. He lied then, too. He hid his student debt, so my credit score would cover the business loan. That fraud invalidates the agreement. David laughed, a dry, barking sound. You should be sitting in this chair, Sarah. Okay, we play dumb. We let him think he's steamrolling us. We let him lie on his financial affidavit. Once he lies to the court under oath, we drop the hammer. One more thing, Sarah said, hesitating for the first time. What's that? My father, she said. Richard doesn't know who he is. I never told him. I wanted to be loved for me, not for the name. David frowned. Who is your father, Sarah? She leaned in and whispered a name. David's eyes went wide. He took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Oh my God. He looked at her with a newfound reverence, and perhaps a little fear. Does Richard have any idea? No, Sarah said. He thinks my dad is a retired mechanic in Richmond. And the judge? David asked. Judge Miller? Judge Miller used to clerk for my father in the 90s, Sarah revealed. But he won't do me any favors. He's a stickler for the rules. But he knows my dad, and he knows a liar when he sees one. David leaned back in his squeaky chair, clasping his hands behind his head. Sarah, we aren't going to just win. We are going to watch a man walk into a buzzsaw. Back in the present, the weeks leading up to the trial were a masterclass in deception. Sarah played the part of the defeated wife perfectly. She wore old clothes. She drove the 2018 Honda. She let Arthur Pendleton, Richard's lawyer, scream at her during depositions, shrinking back in her chair while Richard snickered in the corner. Every insult Richard threw at her, every dollar he hid, every smug look he exchanged with Jessica, Sarah catalogued it. She was fueling the fire. The night before the trial, Richard sent her a text message. Rick, just sign the offer, Sarah. Don't embarrass yourself in court tomorrow. You're out of your league. Sarah looked at the phone, then at the photo on her nightstand, a picture of her and her father fishing when she was 10. She typed back 2 words. Sarah. See you. She turned off the phone and went to sleep. She slept like a baby. Richard, on the other hand, was up until 3 a.m. celebrating his preemptive victory, completely unaware that he was barely a pawn in the game he thought he was controlling. The morning of the hearing, the sky over Chicago was the color of a bruised plum. Rain lashed against the towering glass facade of the Cook County Courthouse, but Richard Sterling barely noticed. He stepped out of his black S-Class Mercedes, an umbrella instantly snapped open by a chauffeur he hired specifically for appearances. He wore a bespoke navy suit, cut Italian slim, and a tie that cost more than Sarah's car. Beside him, Arthur Pendleton, his lawyer, looked like a bulldog squeezed into a pinstripe vest. Arthur carried a sleek leather briefcase and an air of bored superiority. Remember, Arthur muttered as they bypassed the security line, a perk of Arthur's connections. Short answers, don't elaborate. We frame her as a dependent who contributed 0 equity. The judge will want this over by lunch. Inside courtroom 402, the air was stale, smelling of floor wax and old paper. Richard took his seat at the plaintiff's table, drumming his fingers on the mahogany. He scanned the room. There were a few spectators, mostly bored law students, and a reporter from a local business journal Richard had tipped off. He wanted his victory documented. Then Sarah walked in. She looked tired. Her grey cardigan was 2 sizes too big, swallowing her frame. She carried a canvas tote bag instead of a briefcase. Beside her, David Bernard looked like he had slept in his suit. His tie was slightly askew, and he was shuffling a stack of papers that looked like they had been dropped and hastily reorganized. Richard caught Arthur's eye and smirked. It was going to be a slaughter. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Harrison Miller entered. He was a man carved from granite, with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to drill through pretension. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked at the files in front of him, adjusting his reading glasses with methodical precision. Case number 4492. Sterling v. Sterling, Judge Miller intoned, his voice gravelly. "We are here for final arguments and asset division. Mr. Pendleton, you may proceed." Arthur stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't walk to the podium. He stood by his table, projecting casual confidence. "Your Honor," Arthur began, his voice smooth as oil. "This case is straightforward. My client, Mr. Richard Sterling, is a self-made man. He built Sterling Logistics from the ground up through 80-hour work weeks and sheer grit. His wife, while present during the marriage, contributed nothing to the business entity. We have a prenuptial agreement signed 10 years ago, which clearly outlines the separation of assets. We are asking the court to enforce the contract, grant the stipulated settlement of $50,000, and dissolve the marriage." Judge Miller looked over his glasses at Sarah's table. "Mr. Bernard, opening statement?" David Bernard stood up slowly. He looked confused for a split second, patted his pockets as if looking for a pen, and then cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. We contest the validity of the prenup on the grounds of fraudulent inducement, and we contest the plaintiff's current financial affidavit as incomplete." Richard stifled a laugh. "Incomplete? It was a masterpiece of creative fiction." "Very well," Judge Miller said, his face impassive. "Call your first witness." Arthur called Richard to the stand. This was Richard's moment. He walked to the witness box, head high, projecting the image of a burdened captain of industry dealing with a leech. "Mr. Sterling," Arthur asked, pacing the floor, "please describe for the court the state of your finances when you met Ms. Bennett." "I was struggling," Richard lied smoothly. "I had just started the company. I was living on ramen. But I had a vision. I protected that vision because I knew, eventually, it would pay off." "And did Ms. Bennett assist in the operations of Sterling Logistics?" "No," Richard said, looking directly at Sarah with a look of pity. "Sarah is a lovely woman, but she doesn't have a head for business. She couldn't tell a balance sheet from a grocery list. She stayed home, managed the domestic side. I handled the money." "And regarding your current assets," Arthur continued, handing Richard a document, "is this affidavit a true and accurate reflection of your net worth?" Richard glanced at the paper. It listed his net worth at $4 million, a fraction of the reality. It conveniently omitted the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the crypto wallets. "Yes," Richard said, his voice firm. "To the best of my knowledge, this is everything." "Thank you. No further questions." Richard went to stand up, feeling the adrenaline of a perfect performance. "Not so fast, Mr. Sterling," Judge Miller said. "Cross-examination." Richard sat back down, annoyed. He watched David Bernard stumble out from behind his table, holding a single sheet of paper. The lawyer looked harmless. Richard decided to toy with him. David Bernard approached the witness stand, smiling warmly. It was a grandfatherly smile, disarming and gentle. "Mr. Sterling," David began, "you built quite an impressive company, Sterling Logistics. It's known for its efficiency." "Thank you," Richard replied, checking his watch. "Efficiency is key." "Indeed. Now you just stated under oath that your wife, Sarah, had no involvement in the business. Is that correct? That is correct. David nodded, looking at the floor. So, she didn't set up the original QuickBooks server in 2015? Richard blinked. I hired a consultant for that. Really? David walked back to his table and picked up a piece of paper. Because I have an email here dated August 14th, 2015, from you to Sarah. Subject line, help. The body reads, Babe, the payroll system crashed again. Can you fix the SQL database like you did last month? I can't afford a tech guy. Do you recall sending that? Richard stiffened. I might have asked for minor help once or twice. Technical support isn't business management. Of course, David mumbled. He picked up another paper. And here is a series of wire transfers from Sarah's personal savings account, money she inherited from her grandmother, into the Sterling Logistics business account in 2016, totaling $40,000. Was that technical support, too? That was a loan, Richard snapped. I paid it back. Did you? We can't find the record of repayment. David waved his hand dismissively. But let's move on to the big stuff, the money. You stated your net worth is $4 million. Give or take, Richard said, his palms beginning to sweat. The air conditioning in the room suddenly felt broken. Mr. Sterling, are you familiar with a company called Nebula Corp? The silence that followed was absolute. Richard felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. How? Nebula Corp was registered in Nevada under a blind trust. There was no link to him. I believe I've heard of it. A competitor, maybe? David turned to the judge. Your Honor, permission to approach the witness with Evidence Exhibit C. Judge Miller nodded. David handed a thick binder to Richard. Please turn to tab 3, David said, his voice dropping the grandfatherly tone. It was sharper now. This is a deed of trust for a commercial warehouse in Reno, Nevada, purchased by Nebula Corp 3 months ago for $6 million cash. Now, turn to tab 4. Richard's hands shook as he turned the page. Tab 4 is a bank record from the Cayman Islands, David continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. It shows a transfer of $6 million from Sterling Logistics to a shell company in the British Virgin Islands, and then immediately to Nebula Corp, and who is listed as the sole signatory for the Cayman account. Richard stared at the page. His signature was there. It was digital, encrypted, supposed to be impossible to trace. I can explain, Richard stammered. That's a holding strategy for tax purposes. It's standard practice. Is it standard practice to omit it from a court-ordered financial affidavit? David asked. He didn't wait for an answer. Turn to tab 5, please. Arthur Pendleton stood up. Objection. Your Honor, we haven't had time to review these documents. This is trial by ambush. Overruled, Judge Miller said, his voice cutting like a knife. He was leaning forward now, staring at Richard with an intensity that was terrifying. Sit down, Mr. Pendleton. I want to hear about tab 5. Richard turned the page. It was a printout of a chat log. Recipient, Jessica Thorne, my love. Sender, Rick Sterling. Date, 2 weeks ago. Message, don't worry about the house in Lake Geneva. Once the divorce is finalized, I'll transfer the Nebula funds. She won't see a dime. The prenup is a lock. A gasp rippled through the small gallery. Richard looked up, his face draining of color. He looked at Jessica's name on the page, then at Sarah. Sarah wasn't looking at the floor anymore. She was looking right at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It was almost bored. It was the look of someone watching a bug struggle on a pin. Mr. Sterling, David said, leaning on the witness box railing. You lied about your assets, you lied about your wife's contributions, and you conspired to hide marital funds to fund a new life with your mistress, Ms. Thorne. Is that correct?" "I take the fifth," Richard croaked. "This is civil court, Mr. Sterling," Judge Miller boomed. "You cannot plead the fifth to avoid admitting you defrauded this court. Answer the question." Richard looked at Arthur for help, but his lawyer was busy, furiously texting on his phone, likely trying to minimize the damage to his own reputation. Richard was alone. "It's my money!" Richard suddenly shouted, slamming his hand on the wood. The facade cracked. "I earned it. She sat at home while I bled for that company." Why should she get half just because she signed a piece of paper 10 years ago? "Because," David said softly, closing the binder, "that piece of paper is a contract, and you just admitted to violating it by hiding assets at the time of signing, which we can also prove you did regarding your student loans, and by hiding them now, you have invalidated the prenup." David turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss the prenuptial agreement as null and void due to fraudulent inducement and material breach. We ask for an equitable division of all assets, including Nebula Corp., the Belize estate, and the hidden crypto wallets listed in tab 6. Judge Miller looked at Richard. The look was one of pure disgust. "Motion granted. The prenup is tossed." Richard felt the room spin. The prenup was gone. Half. She was going to get half. Sterling Logistics would have to be liquidated to pay her out. He was ruined. But David Bernard wasn't done. He walked back to his table and whispered something to Sarah. She nodded. David turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, there is one final matter regarding character and credibility. Mr. Sterling has built his entire defense on the idea that he is a man of superior standing, and that his wife is nobody, a woman of no consequence. I think we've established his credibility is non-existent," Judge Miller grumbled. "True," David said. "But Mr. Sterling seems to believe he granted Sarah a favor by marrying her. He claims he lifted her up from obscurity. He has frequently mentioned in depositions that she comes from bad stock and trash." Richard's jaw tightened. He had said those things. He believed them. "I would like to address the court regarding the family Mr. Sterling claims is trash," David said. Judge Miller took off his glasses. He looked from David to Sarah. A flicker of recognition passed through the judge's eyes, something he had been suppressing until this moment. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Miller said, his voice dangerously soft again. "You have spent the last hour lying to my face. You have insulted the intelligence of this court. But before I issue my final ruling on the division of assets, answer me one question." Richard swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was full of sand. "Yes, Your Honor. Do you actually know who your wife's father is?" Richard looked at Sarah. She was just Sarah. Her dad was a mechanic. He sent them a card with a $20 bill in it every Christmas. He's a mechanic," Richard stammered, "from Richmond." Judge Miller leaned back, a dark, humorless smile touching his lips. "Is that what she told you?" The judge looked at the bailiff. "Open the rear doors, please." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a groan that seemed to echo Richard's own internal unraveling. He turned in his chair, half expecting a squad of police officers or perhaps a news crew. Instead, a single, solitary figure walked into the room. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and a face weathered by sun and age. He wore a simple, slightly rumpled tweed jacket over a button-down shirt that looked like it had been bought at a department store sale. He walked with a slight limp, leaning on a plain wooden cane. Richard blinked, confusion warring with the panic rising in his chest. He knew this man. It was Sarah's father, William. Richard had only met him a handful of times over the last 10 years. Sarah usually visited him alone in Virginia. The few times William had come to Chicago, Richard had made sure to be busy with work. He remembered the last Thanksgiving William had attended. Richard had spent the entire dinner checking his emails, rolling his eyes whenever the old man told a story about fixing a transmission or restoring an old Ford truck. Richard had even mocked him to his friends later, calling him the grease monkey. "What is he doing here?" Richard hissed at Arthur. "This is a courtroom, not a family reunion. Get him out." Arthur didn't answer. Arthur had gone completely still. He was staring at the old man with a look of dawning horror, his mouth slightly agape. The old man walked down the center aisle. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't look at Richard. He looked straight at the bench. Judge Harrison Miller, the man who had been terrifyingly strict for the last 2 hours, did something that made the air leave the room. He stood up. "Justice Bennett," Judge Miller said, nodding respectfully. Richard's head whipped around. "Justice?" "Good morning, Harrison," William said. His voice wasn't the soft, rambling tone Richard remembered from Thanksgiving. It was deep, resonant, and commanded the space effortlessly. "I apologize for the interruption. I was hoping to remain a spectator, but my daughter's lawyer thought my presence might clarify a few things regarding character." Richard felt like the floor was tilting. "Justice?" he whispered to Arthur. Why did he call him Justice? Arthur finally found his voice, though it was a strangled squeak. "You idiot!" he hissed at Richard, his face pale as a sheet. "That's not a mechanic. That's William Bennett. He served on the state Supreme Court for 20 years. Before that, he was the Attorney General who took down the Gambino operations in the 90s. They called him the Iron Gavel." Richard stared at the old man, the mechanic, the man he had laughed at, the man he had once tipped $5 to buy himself a better beer during a visit, thinking he was being generous to a peasant. William Bennett finally turned his gaze toward the plaintiff's table. He looked at Richard with a calmness that was far more terrifying than anger. "Mr. Sterling," William said pleasantly, "you seem confused." I thought you fixed cars," Richard managed to choke out. "I do," William smiled. "It's my hobby. I like taking things that are broken and making them run right again. It keeps me humble. It reminds me that if you ignore the rust, the whole engine falls apart." He paused, his eyes hardening. "Kind of like a marriage based on fraud." Judge Miller remained standing. "Mr. Sterling, when you told this court your wife came from trash and had no resources, were you aware that her father is the author of Bennett on Civil Procedure, the very textbook law students use to study asset forfeiture?" Richard couldn't speak. He looked at Sarah. She was watching him, not with triumph, but with a profound sadness. "I never told you," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying across the silence. "Because I wanted to know if you loved me, Richard, or if you just wanted the connections. When we met, I used my mother's maiden name. I wanted to build something of my own. And when I saw how you treated people you thought were beneath you, waiters, janitors, my mechanic father, I knew who you really were. I just kept hoping you'd change." "But I didn't," Richard whispered. "No," Sarah said. "You just got greedier." William Bennett stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "You see, Richard, Sarah asked me not to intervene. She wanted to handle this herself. She's a brilliant accountant, far smarter than I ever was. But when I heard you were hiding assets, committing perjury in a court of law, I decided to come watch." William turned to the judge. "Harrison, I believe the witness was in the middle of explaining why he has $6 million in a Cayman account that he swore didn't exist." Judge Miller sat back down, his face like thunder. Indeed he was. Richard looked at Arthur. "Fix this," he begged. "Object. Do something." Arthur Pendleton began packing his briefcase. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded. "I'm withdrawing as counsel," Arthur muttered, not making eye contact. "I can't represent a client who induces me to suborn perjury. You lied to me, Richard. You told me the disclosure was complete. If I stay on this case, I get disbarred. You're on your own." "You can't leave me," Richard shouted. "Watch me," Arthur said. He stood up, bowed to the judge, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Richard Sterling sat alone at the heavy wooden table. The silence was deafening. He looked at Jessica in the gallery. She was furiously typing on her phone. As he watched, she stood up, gathered her purse, and slipped out the back door, just as Arthur had. He was completely, utterly alone. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Miller said, his voice ringing with finality. "Since your counsel has fled the sinking ship, you represent yourself. Do you have any defense for the evidence presented by Mr. Bernard regarding the hidden assets?" Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat was dry. His empire, the logistics firm, the reputation, the future he had planned, was dissolving like sugar in hot water. It was a misunderstanding," Richard tried, his voice trembling. "A $6 million misunderstanding." Judge Miller raised an eyebrow. "And the texts to your mistress? Was that a typo?" Richard put his head in his hands. "I'll take that as a no," Judge Miller said. "Stand up, Mr. Sterling." Richard stood. His legs felt like jelly. He gripped the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. The confident, arrogant CEO who had walked in that morning was gone. In his place was a terrified man in an expensive suit that suddenly felt like a costume. "Richard Sterling," Judge Miller began, reading from a fresh sheet of notes he had been writing. "This court finds you in contempt. Furthermore, based on the irrefutable evidence provided by the defense, I am issuing a summary judgment." The judge looked over his glasses. "The prenuptial agreement is hereby voided ab initio due to fraudulent inducement. We revert to state equitable distribution laws. However," the judge paused, and Richard felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he would just lose half. He could survive half. He could rebuild. "However," the judge continued, his voice hardening, "equity does not mean equal when one party has engaged in dissipation of marital assets and fraud. This court has the discretion to penalize such behavior to make the injured party whole. The court awards Sarah Bennett 100% of the marital home," the judge ruled, 100% of the liquid savings, and regarding Sterling Logistics. Richard held his breath. "Not the company. Please, not the company." "The evidence shows that Ms. Bennett provided critical unpaid labor and financial investment to start the firm, which you never repaid. Furthermore, you used the company to commit fraud against the marital estate. Therefore, the court orders that 51% of the shares of Sterling Logistics be transferred to Sarah Bennett immediately. You will retain a minority stake of 49%. 51%? Richard gasped. That gives her controlling interest. She can fire me." "That is generally how controlling interest works." "Yes," Judge Miller said dryly. "And given your management style, a change in leadership might be beneficial." "You can't do this," Richard shouted, panic overtaking reason. "I built that company. I am Sterling Logistics." "Not anymore," Sarah said. She hadn't raised her voice once. She sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap. "Now, you're just a minority shareholder, Richard, and I have some serious questions about your expense reports." "We're not done," Judge Miller interrupted. "Mr. Sterling, Civil Asset Division is the least of your problems. You just admitted, under oath, to hiding assets and falsifying financial affidavits. You also admitted to tax evasion regarding the Belize property." The judge pressed a button on his bench. The side door opened, and two uniformed sheriff's deputies stepped in. They weren't the bailiffs. These were serious men with grim expressions. "I am referring the transcript of this hearing and all evidence collected by Mr. Bernard to the District Attorney's Office for prosecution regarding perjury, fraud, and potential money laundering," Judge Miller stated. "Deputies, please take Mr. Sterling into custody. I am setting bail at $5 million, given the defendant is a documented flight risk with offshore accounts." "Custody!" Richard shrieked as the deputies approached him. "Arrested? Me? I'm a CEO." "Turn around, hands behind your back," one of the deputies said, spinning Richard around. The cold click of handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. Richard felt the cold steel against his wrists, a sensation so alien, so impossible, that his brain refused to process it. He looked wildly around the room. "Sarah!" he yelled. "Sarah, tell them! You can't let them take me to jail! I'm your husband!" Sarah stood up slowly. She picked up her tote bag. She walked over to the railing where Richard was being held. "You're not my husband, Richard," she said, her voice devoid of hate, which hurt worse. "You're my ex-husband, and you did this to yourself." "I'll fix it," Richard pleaded, tears streaming down his face now. "I'll give you the money. I'll give you the house. Just don't let them take me." "It's not about the money, Richard," Sarah said. "It never was." She turned to her father. William Bennett was watching Richard with a look of disappointment. "You should have learned to fix things," William said to Richard, "instead of just throwing them away." The deputies hauled Richard out. He was sobbing, his expensive shoes dragging on the carpet, begging for a lawyer who had already left the building. The doors swung shut behind him, leaving a ringing silence in the courtroom. Sarah let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted. David Bernard packed up his files, grinning like a Cheshire cat. "Well," he said, "that went better than expected. I think I'll take that celebratory drink now." Judge Miller stepped down from the bench. He walked over to Sarah and William. The judicial mask fell away, replaced by the warmth of an old friend. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Sarah," the judge said gently. "It had to be done," Sarah replied. She looked at her father. "Thank you for coming, Dad. I know I said I didn't need you to." "You didn't need me," William said, putting a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You had him beat before I walked in the door. I just wanted to see my girl stand up for herself." Sarah smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "He's going to lose everything, isn't he? The company, the money, his freedom." William nodded. "But the worst part for a man like Richard isn't losing his stuff. It's losing his audience. He has no one left to impress." Sarah walked to the window of the courtroom. The rain had stopped. A sliver of sunlight was piercing through the grey clouds over Chicago. "So," David Bernard asked, coming up beside them, "you own a logistics empire now, majority shareholder. What's your first move, Ms. Bennett?" Sarah looked at the city skyline. She thought about the employees Richard had terrorized. She thought about the corners he had cut. She thought about the efficiency that came at the cost of people's livelihoods. "My first move?" Sarah said, a steely determination entering her voice. I'm going to audit the entire company. Every receipt, every email, every contract. And then I'm going to run it the right way." "And Richard?" David asked. Sarah turned back to the empty plaintiff's table. "Richard who?" The holding cell at the Cook County Jail smelled of bleach and unwashed bodies, a sensory assault that Richard Sterling tried to block out by pressing his face against the cold cinder-block wall. It had been 6 hours since the deputies hauled him out of Judge Miller's courtroom. 6 hours since his life had effectively ended. He had used his one phone call to dial Jessica. He needed her to access the emergency cash stash in the floor safe at the penthouse. He needed her to call a bail bondsman. He needed to hear a friendly voice. The call had gone straight to a disconnected recording. Richard stared at the graffiti scratched into the metal bench opposite him. "She's gone," he realized, the icy grip of panic finally settling into a dull ache in his gut. She didn't just leave the courtroom. She left the country. He wasn't wrong. At that exact moment, Jessica Thorne was boarding a flight to Zurich. She had spent the last 3 months siphoning off the allowance Richard gave her into her own private accounts. She knew Richard was sloppy. She knew he was arrogant. She had bet on him losing, and she had hedged her bets perfectly. She ordered a glass of champagne as the plane took off, deleting Richard's contact information from her phone with a manicured thumb. She didn't look back. Back in Chicago, the transition of power was swift and brutal. The next morning, the employees of Sterling Logistics arrived at the glass and steel headquarters to find security guards escorting the VP of Finance and the Chief Operating Officer out of the building. These were Richard's cronies, the men who had helped him cook the books. They carried cardboard boxes, their faces pale and drawn. Standing in the lobby, wearing a sharp charcoal blazer and tailored trousers, was Sarah Bennett. She didn't look like the mouse Richard had described to his board members. She looked like an owner. She gathered the staff in the main atrium. There was a murmur of fear. They all knew the rumors: the CEO arrested, the assets frozen. They expected mass layoffs. They expected the company to fold. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the hall. "My name is Sarah Bennett. As of yesterday, I am the majority shareholder of this company." She paused, making eye contact with the receptionists, the drivers, the mid-level managers, the people Richard had ignored. "I know you're scared," she continued. "Richard Sterling ran this company on fear and deception. That ends today. We are going to open the books. We are going to cooperate with the authorities. And we are going to rebuild this brand on integrity." She held up a file. "I have reviewed the payroll. I noticed that executive bonuses have gone up 300% in 5 years, while driver wages have remained stagnant. That changes now. The executive bonus pool is frozen. Effective immediately, every driver and warehouse worker is receiving a 10% raise." The silence stretched for a heartbeat, and then applause broke out. It started tentatively, then grew into a roar. Sarah watched them, feeling a lump in her throat. Richard had viewed these people as tools. Sarah viewed them as partners. Up in the executive suite, Sarah walked into Richard's office. It was a monument to narcissism. There were framed magazine covers of himself on every wall, a putting green in the corner, a humidor full of Cuban cigars. "Mr. Bernard," Sarah said to her lawyer, who was leaning against the doorframe eating a bagel, "get a crew in here, burn the furniture, donate the suits. I want this room stripped to the studs. I don't want a single molecule of Richard Sterling left in this building." "With pleasure," David Bernard chuckled. "Oh, and you have a visitor." Sarah turned. Her father, William, was standing there. He looked at the opulent office with a bemused expression. "A bit much, wasn't it?" William noted, tapping a gold-plated stapler with his cane. He needed to feel big, Sarah said, tossing the stapler into a trash bin. Dad, did you hear about the bail hearing? William nodded, his expression turning serious. I spoke to the district attorney this morning. Richard's bail was denied. It turns out Jessica Thorne was stopped by Interpol in Zurich. She cut a deal to avoid prosecution. She gave them everything, Sarah. The passwords, the ledgers, the names of the politicians Richard was bribing. Sarah let out a long breath she felt like she'd been holding for a decade. So he's not getting out. He's looking at 15 to 20 years, William said. Federal charges for wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. And since he tried to hide it all from a family court judge, well, let's just say, the legal system doesn't take kindly to being treated like a fool. Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the same view Richard had gloated over just 24 hours earlier. But where Richard saw a kingdom to conquer, Sarah saw a city full of opportunities to do good. Do you want to see him? William asked gently. He's been asking for you. He says he wants to apologize. Sarah thought about it. She thought about the years of gaslighting, the way he made her feel small so he could feel big, the way he looked at her in the courtroom, not with love, but with desperation for his lost assets. No, Sarah said firmly. He doesn't want to apologize. He wants to manipulate me. He wants to see if the nice girl is still in here, waiting to forgive him. She turned back to her father, her eyes clear and bright. The nice girl is gone, Dad. She grew up. 3 months later, the sign on the building was changed. Sterling Logistics was gone. In its place, bright blue letters read, Bennett & Co., Supply Chain Solutions. Sarah sat in her new office. It was modest, filled with plants and natural light. The gold plating was gone. On her desk sat a single photo frame, her and her father on a fishing boat, laughing. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from David Bernard. David. Final decree signed. You are officially divorced. Richard took the plea deal this morning. 12 years. No parole for at least 10. Sarah stared at the screen. She expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she just felt peace. It was a quiet, settling sensation, like dust settling after a storm. She typed back, Thank you, David. Lunch is on me. She put the phone down and looked at the stack of files on her desk. Actual work. Honest work. She picked up a pen, ready to start the next chapter of her life. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a bitter ex-wife. She was Sarah Bennett, CEO, daughter of a lion, and a woman who had walked through fire and come out made of steel. And as for Richard Sterling, he was currently sitting in a federal processing center, wearing a jumpsuit that didn't fit, eating food that had no flavor, telling anyone who would listen that he used to be a king. But nobody was listening anymore. What a roller coaster of justice. Richard Sterling thought he was the main character of the world, untouchable, smarter than everyone else, and above the law. He made the fatal mistake that so many narcissists make. He underestimated the quiet person in the room. He mistook Sarah's kindness for weakness, and her silence for stupidity. He didn't realize that while he was building a house of cards, she was building a case. This story serves as a powerful reminder that the truth always has a way of coming out. You can hide money, you can hide affairs, but you cannot hide your character forever. Richard celebrated his victory before the game was even over, and in the end, he lost not just his money, but his freedom and his legacy. It's a satisfying end to a man who took everything for granted. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, brilliant revenge, and sweet justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good drama, and hit subscribe with the notification bell on so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.